ABT is a Bible translation organization. You all know that. But it is more than that. So Joel Martin has talked about ABT's laser focus. ABT only inserts itself in those contexts where a Bible translation is needed. There are hundreds of ministry contexts where Bible translations exist, and other needs still exist in those communities. But ABT has chosen to focus on those communities, those language groups, which still are in need of a Bible translation. But ABT's activities, the activities of the team, are not strictly related to translation. ABT teams frequently engage in other kinds of activities, and that's my goal this morning, to give you all a picture of the things that ABT teams do. So let's look first at the beginning reality of ABT teams. There we go. The beginning reality. So these are a description of the context where ABT teams will go. So a people group with no witness of the gospel among them and no way to access the gospel. That's a general description of one type of context. Or a people group with limited access to the gospel, but significant obstacles still stand between them and the goal. So what is the goal? We'll touch on that more a little bit later. It's already been mentioned. I'll tell you right now. It is communities of believers in every language group living out the Word of God. So the lack of a Bible translation is one of those obstacles, but there are other obstacles that stand between them and the goal. What may those obstacles be? Let's take another look at that. There we go. Overcoming the obstacles. As I already said, there are typically many obstacles which stand between an unreached people group and a thriving indigenous church. And each obstacle requires a unique strategy to overcome it. So here we have some of these obstacles. There are others, but I would say some of the chief ones that ABT will typically encounter are the lack of a Bible, illiteracy, lack of discipleship, acute needs, lack of economic opportunity or chronic needs, and a hostile environment. Okay, lack of a Bible. So this, obviously a need. If a people group does not have a Bible, they will never have full access to the Word of God. How do you overcome this obstacle? Through a translation project. So this is one of the activities that ABT teams engage in. There are typically one or two trained translators on an ABT team, and it's a lengthy process. Sometimes it requires developing orthography, a writing system for the language before you can even begin translation. Sometimes it requires analyzing a language before you can even develop the orthography. But the lack of a Bible is overcome through a Bible translation project. Once a Bible exists, or as a Bible is coming into existence, it still does no good if the people can't read it. Illiteracy, another obstacle that stands between unchurched people group and thriving churches in that people group. That is overcome through a literacy project. So this often requires developing some kind of primer curriculum, bringing in somebody who's trained in this field, working with them to develop these primers, going and having literacy workshops with the people, and the long-term goal is to train them, to train trainers that can go on to teach others in their people group to read. Lack of discipleship. Sometimes there are a few believers in a people group. Maybe they have a Bible, maybe they have portions of a Bible, they've come to know the Lord through previous contact with Christians, but there is not a thriving church there. And so ABT teams will disciple, teach the baby Christians, train teachers, train church leaders who can go on to lead in their churches, in their communities. Acute needs. So sometimes this is not a big focus of All Nations Bible Translation, but we expect sometime acute needs will come up. Sometimes people cannot think about eternity because they're too focused on staying alive today or tomorrow. Think about disasters. Maybe your people are starving. They probably won't be able to listen to you teach the Bible to them if they haven't had anything to eat for 5 days, if they're dying from exposure. So acute needs overcome through relief projects, food, housing, medical, etc. Ideally, this would be very short term. And then lack of economic opportunity, or what you could consider chronic needs. So how does this stand as an obstacle between an unchurched people and communities of believers in every language group? Could be various reasons. One is sometimes if there's lack of economic opportunity in an area, all or most of the working age men will travel outside the community for extended periods of time in order to earn money to support their families. That is counteractive to a thriving church. If these are men who should be at home with their families, discipling their children, leading the church, if they're gone half the time, 3/4 of the time, they cannot lead the church and lead their families as they should. So this is a focus of ABT teams, community development projects, working to develop the opportunities that can be found in every context. Community development projects often have side benefits such as building trust with the local people or giving a Bible translation project, a church planting project, legitimacy in the eyes of a hostile government, whether that's a hostile national government or a hostile local government. Community development projects can often be the way in and be a door to other activities. And a hostile environment. This is another obstacle that can sometimes stand between an unchurched people group and communities of believers. We all know that in many contexts, especially think maybe of Muslim context, Hindu context, people who choose to follow the teachings of Jesus will face threats from their community, maybe from their family, maybe from community leaders. So how can this obstacle be overcome? Maybe it can be through advocacy. If it's a problem at a national level or a regional level, perhaps ABT teams can work at getting those laws changed, or support and providing an alternate community for those who choose to follow Christ. If their decision to follow Christ means ostracization from their home community, where will they find support once they make that decision to follow Jesus? At least at the beginning, the team can provide that community, discipleship, the close fellowship that those new Christians need until a larger Christian community exists in that people group to give them the long-term support they need. So these are the obstacles that frequently stand between unchurched people groups and thriving communities of believers in that specific language group. And so we've looked at the kinds of activities that ABT teams engage in to overcome those obstacles. And then the goal is communities of believers in every language group living out the Word of God. And specifically, communities of believers that are thriving, that are growing, that are self-governing, that are reaching out to the communities around them, evangelizing, discipling others. So now we're going to put this all together. This is a timeline that our team, the Meeks Tech team, put together some 4 years ago, I believe. And you may not be able to see that very well, but we just put on there like the entry points, which our team was going to get on the field, the proposed times, years where we could start engaging in certain activities, maybe teaching, maybe literacy, maybe Bible translation. So that's just an example of a timeline. On the right, you can see, again, the kinds of activities practically that ABT teams will engage in. Preparation, this is often before going to the field. CLA, that stands for Culture and Language Acquisition. Ministry and Exit. So in order to illustrate this, I have a story of a hypothetical ABT team. But first I would like to emphasize these activities are not strictly linear. It's not that you prepare, then you stop preparing and you start on culture and language learning, then you stop that and you start on ministry, and then you stop that and you get ready to leave. It's not linear like that. Ministry, ideally, will start from the very beginning. Also the exit strategy. The exit strategy should be in place and start being implemented at the very beginning of your ministry among that people group. So with that, let's hear this story of an ABT team. Their names are John and Sarah Martin, William and Becky Mast, and James and Elizabeth Miller. And these three families, they joined ABT within a year's time. The Martins were an older family. They had teenagers, while the other two families had only a couple young children. Families were from different parts of the country, had not met each other prior to joining ABT, got to know each other after they had joined through a camp week, and they began forming bonds together. The Martin family, the ones with the teenagers, the older family, they'd had an interest in Central Asia for some years, and as bonds began developing between the three families, the others followed that interest, took on that interest in Central Asia as they began discussing forming a team. Training took them several years. The two younger families were still paying off their houses. The Martins had interest in community development, taking advantage of John Martin's mechanical aptitude, his handyman skills, whereas William Mass and James Miller and their wives were a little more on the geeky side, and so they went and studied linguistics and biblical languages. William studied Greek for New Testament translation, while James studied Hebrew for Old Testament translation. So after much prayer and discussion, these families committed to working together, and they did some survey, found a target people group in Central Asia, and began preparations for context. So investigation quickly showed that it would be difficult to get into that country. It was a restricted access country. It'd be difficult to get in there and live among the target people. There was an authoritarian government that kind of restricted access of foreigners and especially Christians to the region. But after some investigation, they found that they could get in on an investor's visa. The government provided foreign investors with a platform for living in the country. So they found some financial backing with some connections that they had here in the States with financial means. And while they were still here in the States, they began studying the language of wider communication, or the trade language for that region. Soon before leaving, the three families met here for a team launch, kind of a final training and send-off here at ABT. Their team almost ended right there when the team compatibility assessment showed some hitherto unrevealed doctrinal positions that were a little bit unexpected, but after some prayer, seeking the Lord, and discussion, they found that they could work through it, and they left for the field. So this period of their years of study, their team formation, choosing a people group, and getting ready for entry took them about 5 years. They moved into a small city close to the region where their target people group lived. They continued studying the trade language, the language of wider communication, while completing the necessary paperwork to get long-term visas in the country. And during this time, they were investigating business possibilities. This period took them about 1.5 years, learning the trade language, kind of getting settled in the larger area. They were then able to move into a town of the target people group, the region that they had been thinking about and praying about for some years. So initially, this people group were kind of suspicious of the outsiders, but the team gained trust as the people realized their good intentions as they shared with them what they were there to do. The family slowly found individuals willing to help with language learning. The more outgoing members of the team, mostly the Martin family, the non-geeky ones, they made friends faster and soon had a large relationship network. The others were able to benefit from that as well. The people of the region made cotton handicrafts, and John was able to start a slipper workshop. They made high-quality slippers, which were shipped out of the region, some of them internationally, and that met the requirements for their foreign investors' visas. Also helped the economics of the local region. And this period of learning the local language was 3.5 years. So after 5 years after entering the country, 1.5 years learning the trade language, 3.5 years studying the local language, getting some community development projects going, and they gained enough proficiency in the language to begin with some translation work. So they began by making some literacy booklets. They began translating some Creation to Christ teaching lessons. So kind of a curriculum of Bible lessons that goes from the Bible from the beginning to the end, sharing the news of God's creation of the world, his interaction with people, and finally the incarnation of Jesus Christ in language that is a little easier to understand than an actual Bible translation. So they began translating these Creation to Christ Bible lessons. They discovered that some of the people had visions of outsiders bringing good news to them. These visions had been going on for some years prior to their arrival in the region. They finished translating the Creation to Christ lessons, received an overall positive response. They found that those who had the visions of them arriving were the most open to respond to the gospel. A few of the men who went through that initial teaching really showed promise as leaders, and the team put special focus into discipling them. Earlier, they had made some literacy booklets to kind of develop interest in reading the local language among the people. At this point, they developed a full literacy course, taught it to a few groups of people, and trained literacy teachers to go on teaching it without their personal involvement. This period of translating the Creation to Christ, the initial teaching, and literacy development took just over 2 years. They went on to teach the Creation to Christ teaching with a second group of people. The men who had showed promise as leaders were asked to participate in the teaching to help, and they also began some serious Bible translation. Some portions of the Bible had already been translated to accompany the Creation to Christ teaching, but they went on to translate book by book rather than selected passages. Some local translation helpers were recruited, trained, equipped to work alongside them, and translation goes well for 8 years. Through that time, the local translation helpers gain more and more skills and eventually are able to take on the bulk of the translation work. 8 years after serious translation had started, there was a serious earthquake that struck the region. It caused a lot of damage. The team, ABT team, and the local church leaders helped coordinate the distribution of United Nations provided aid in the region and helped with ongoing rebuilding. And the followers of Jesus, the local church, got a really good name in the region from this. But in other areas of the country, this foreign provided aid caused some problems and corruption among local leaders in other regions. And the authoritarian government chose to blame those who had provided the aid, those foreign nations, for the problems. And they decided to purge foreigners from the country. The team had not intended to leave for some time. The translation was roughly about half done, but they were forced to leave the country. From the time they had entered the country and began language learning to this point, they had spent a total of 15 years in the country. So their exit was sudden. They were only given about a month and a half to prepare to leave. The church leaders had now been following Christ for almost 10 years, and they were quite mature Christians. The local church had been making evangelism trips into the surrounding region for a few years. A church network was forming. Those initial men who had showed promise of church leadership were now quite skilled in their roles. John Martin had trained local managers for the slipper factory, and so the transition to full local oversight was quite easy. The Martin family returned to the States after being expelled from their country, and John now helps train future community development facilitators. The Mass and the Millers stayed in a nearby country to help finish the translation, provide kind of a consultant role. They stayed nearby so they could have infrequent contact with their translation team still on the ground. After 7 more years, they completed the translation of the Bible, 15 years after translation had begun, and the manuscript is sent to the publishers. After the Bible was printed, the local church held a festive dedication service, which the ABT team had to watch remotely because they were not allowed back into the country. It was bittersweet for them, but they trust that they will meet their brothers and sisters in heaven. From initiating preparation to completing the translation, the dedication of the Bible, if you weren't keeping track, 27 years from beginning to end for the team. That was a hypothetical situation, but it contains, some of you may recognize elements from situations that ABT teams are having right now, strategies that they're having right now. So the big picture, ABT teams, yes, they do translation, but they also do other things. And it's a complex task. It takes many years, and we need the support and prayer of the sending communities, the sending churches, in order to get anything done for the glory of God.